We are all very familiar with the story of Moses killing an Egyptian who he saw smiting his fellow Hebrew. This is found in Exodus chapter 2. Oftentimes, we hear preaching referring to this incident as murder. But did Moses really commit murder? Statements that Moses committed murder never sat well with me, since Egypt did declare death to Israeli babies in Exodus chapter 1 verses 15 and 22. And later, Egypt did harshly oppress Israel, beat Israel, and gave them unreasonable tasks. Egypt definitely is an enemy to Israel. Find out why I don't believe Moses was a murderer in this edition of Bible Mysteries. After reading the Bible, I am not convinced that Moses committed murder in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. He was defending his innocent, defenseless fellow Hebrew from an Egyptian enforcing Pharaoh's wicked commands towards Israel. Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Israel at that time was in bondage under a murderous, wicked Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. To commit murder, one must kill an innocent man. The Egyptian who was killed by Moses was not an innocent man, but a servant of a wicked Pharaoh who was enemy to the Jewish people. Moses killed the Egyptian for beating his fellow Hebrew. We see in Acts chapter 7 that Moses was defending his Hebrew brother that suffered wrong at the hand of a wicked Egyptian. Nowhere in Acts 7 do we see Moses referred to as a murderer. We do see, however, in Acts 7 that Moses was defending the oppressed from their oppressor. The Bible says in Acts chapter 7, and seeing one of them suffering wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. Based on this verse, we see Moses rescued a fellow Israelite who was suffering wrong at the hands of an Egyptian. Therefore, Moses rescued the Israelite by smiting the Egyptian. Sadly, his fellow Hebrews didn't understand. According to Pastor Byron Chesney, quote, the way I've always understood it was concluding from Acts chapter 7, verse 25, that Moses was acting on direction from God and assumed his fellow Israelites would have understood that. However, it is clear the Israelites living in Egypt at that time were far removed from the God of their fathers and were not discerning of his ways or his called man. Acts chapter 7 verse 25, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand will deliver them, but they understood not. End quote. The Egyptian that was killed by Moses could be compared to a Nazi serving Hitler by guarding an Israeli death camp. To kill a Nazi that is executing Hitler's wicked commands against Israel is not murder, it is justice. We know that our God punishes sin according to Proverbs 11:21. God rebuked and punished Cain for murdering his brother Abel in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10 through 13. If Moses truly murdered the Egyptian, why didn't God rebuke him? God is immutable according to Malachi 3:6 and will always rebuke wickedness, especially the sin of murder. God rebuked Paul for causing Christians to be martyred, Acts chapter 9 verses 4 through 6, but did not rebuke Moses for killing the Egyptian. In fact, God never spoke about Moses killing the Egyptian in contempt. There is not enough biblical evidence to convict Moses of murder. Let us also observe how God and Moses shared similar reactions towards Egypt. Moses, like God, saw the affliction of Israel caused by Egypt. That's Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, and did something about it. Moses beheld his fellow Hebrews' affliction at the hands of the wicked Egyptians and killed the Egyptian. Exodus chapter 2, verse 12. Peradventure, if Moses had not rescued his fellow Hebrew, the Egyptian would have smitten the Hebrew to death. God commands execution to whoever smites an innocent man to death. That's Exodus chapter 21, verse 12. And Moses possibly prevented the death of his fellow Hebrew. God, like Moses, noticed his people's affliction. That's Exodus chapter 3, verses 5 through 9, at the hands of the Egyptians, and therefore used Moses as an agent to rescue his people. Just as Moses rescued his fellow Hebrew from affliction, God rescued Israel from Egypt, causing the affliction. Just as Moses killed the Egyptian, causing the affliction, God killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, Exodus chapter 12, verse 29, and later killed the entire Egyptian army along with wicked Pharaoh. That's Exodus 14, 26 through 28. God killed the Egyptians who desired to enslave and afflict Israel. If Moses committed murder by killing the Egyptian who afflicted his brethren, does that mean God also committed murder? God is not a murderer at all. God is a just God, and even warns Israel that death will come to them if they afflict the stranger that are among them. Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 and 24. Take note that Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 and 24 is clear evidence that Moses was just for killing the Egyptian who had afflicted the Hebrew by way of smiting. In closing, I see no biblical evidence to convict Moses of murder.